Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. And we have a new guest joining us today, Ava Montgomery, who's the CEO and founder of Conscious Media Consulting. How are you doing today, Ava?
I'm doing well, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Welcome to the show. It's going to be an exciting discussion. And before we get started, Reggie, you know how we're going to be going through our normal tradition of saying our gratitude moment. So what are we grateful for this morning? And Ava, since you're new, I'm going to put you right on the spot with this one and give you opportunities to share with us what are you grateful for this morning. And you can be whatever it is that your spirit comes out of your spirit.
Oh, well, my female intuition was ready for you. So I am grateful for waking up this morning, standing, breathing, and being in great company.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Reggie, you want to chime in with yours?
Sure. I'm gonna use my standard really quickly. I'm just really grateful for indoor plumbing, and I have a refrigerator that works and has food in it. But more specifically, I purchased a pineapple with other things when I went shopping a couple of days ago, and it was one of those rarities. It was exactly the right time, and I sliced it open, and it was sweet. It wasn't overly ripe. It was one of it was a perfect pineapple. So little things like that. Just can make my day. So I'm really
Yeah.
grateful for that particular pineapple. But just I'm breathing. My body's pretty healthy, and I have. I was going to say something that you always say, King, but I'm not going to steal yours, so I'll just stop there.
Well, I don't have any ownership for gratitude, so we can share.
Okay, so having a relatively sound mind, as far as I can tell, my thinking process is okay. So I'm really grateful for that.
And before I get into mine, I'm curious. So you buy your pineapples, you don't buy the chunks already cut up. You buy the actual pineapple itself, and you take the core out there.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I'm not happy with the result. I've learned a little bit how to from feel and smell how to get a good one, but it's not for me. It's not an exact science, so it's always a bit of an adventure. But when it's right, it's like any food. When it's exactly the right time for a fruit or a vegetable, it's delicious. So.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, I would say my gratitude moment is I'm grateful for my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have sound mind. I'm grateful for another 24 hours to pursue my purpose. For my mother still being in my life and having a sound mind, and then just the ability to conduct business in this virtual environment the way we are. And I'm grateful for that as well. So that's my gratitude moment. That sets the energy for our show. And today we are going to continue our discussion on the topic of slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights. And again, this is an excerpt from Reggie's book. So Reggie, with that being said, why don't you go ahead and set the context for us, and then we'll go ahead into our discussion from this point.
Yeah, so thank you for that, King. And just really briefly, the book is entitled Healing America's Narratives, and the subtitle is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And one of the chapters in the book deals specifically with race in America, and more specifically with African American history. Not only that, but primarily. So that's the context within which we'll be talking today. A brief note on shadow. In the word shadow in the title rather, refers to the Jungian sense of shadow, that which an individual or an organization or a nation denies about itself and projects out onto others. So that's what I mean by shadow. And the shadow of the United States, in terms of the argument I make in terms of my research, is that the hidden, denied part of the United States is grounded in an unhealthy iteration of the masculine energy, which needs to be balanced by a healthy iteration of feminine energy. So again, I'm not saying that men are bad, women are good, or the feminine is correct and the masculine is incorrect. I'm saying an unhealthy masculine domination is, if it's not the primary source of our problems, it's one of the significant sources. And what we yearn for, I believe, as a nation is an integration with the healthy iteration of the feminine, because either masculine or feminine can be healthy or unhealthy. So that's a brief synopsis of a longer story. And today's focus again is on slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights.
And now, again, those are all obviously different eras. And so our comments can just give you context, Ava, can be on any of those eras. It don't have to your comment doesn't have to include all three. You can pick slavery, you can pick Jim Crow, you can pick civil rights. You want to make comments about, so you're not limited in that regard. But I'm going to start by just first saying that my approach to think about slavery is I've gone through the years, and to be honest, I've put a sense of pride in it, not pride of being a slave or having ancestors who were slaves, but understanding the context of what slavery did to our people here. Because the fact is, slavery, in my estimate, my understanding, it weeded out the folks that were weak, not weak in the context of just mentally weak, but what I mean by that is it had the process of the folks who came through the transatlantic slave trade that died off, the folks who died in the slave making process in the islands of the Jamaicas and the Caribbean islands, and then the other folks who died as a result. So we are descendants from the strongest breed of that stock. And that to me is a sense of pride in that being descendants from those individuals, there's a sense of pride to know what we've come through. And as a result, within 2 centuries, we've been able to achieve the level of success we have, even to the level of presidency. And so I don't look at slavery as a shameful part of my past. I look at it as pride and context that what my ancestors endured helps set the context of what I'm capable of doing. And that to me is where my pride stems from. Now, I say that because what I don't like, and that's where I see movies such as, and I don't blame so much Roots, because that was a very first exposure to a documentary about slavery. So I get that's the first attempt. But what I hate is watching movies that constantly show where we're just weak as slaves and there was no strength at all other than the collective family. And I think that that's a false narrative that I want to see change. And there's other slave movies that come out that kind of show some strength in the slaves, such as Sankofa, that I was proud to see. But I just kind of want to set that as my initial thoughts on our discussion. So, Ava, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts that you want to share as well.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on the last part where you talking about showing us as enslaved people. So I think there's 2 things that I personally like to address when talking about slavery, and that is slavery, the term itself lets people off the hook. Black, African people, Native, Indigenous people from the Hispaniolas, they were enslaved by someone. And we need to, when we say they're enslaved, then that asks the question, by who? And those people need to be part of the discussion. There were enslavers, and then there were people who were enslaved. And so I really like to emphasize that. But also, we were not enslaved. This is the other thing. We were not born slaves. We were born human, and we were enslaved. And prior to coming over to the United States, or the founding colonies at the time, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Hispaniola area, formerly Hispaniola, we came over, or our people came over as something or someone in their community. They were functioning in a profession, maybe not so much said so at the time, but we had medicine people, we had scientists, we had all sorts of people who were doing something, contributing to the phenomenal societies that historically are present in Africa. So when we talk about who was brought over, humans were brought over, but there were functioning humans and the integral parts of society that they had founded back in Africa or the origins from which they came. And so I think that's important, an important part of the conversation too. That number one, we were not born slaves, we were enslaved, and we need to say that so that people can be accountable for being the enslavers. And two, that we had lives before coming here. And I say we, but of course I am talking about the legacy of our ancestors. So that's, I'll stop there.
Well, I love the
Get on a
fact.
soapbox.
I'm sorry.
I said I don't want to get on a soapbox, but those 2 points or 3 points are important to me.
No, I think those are excellent points, and I definitely appreciate the clarification on that, because you're absolutely right. And now that you said it in that context, I'm going to work to be more mindful of using that terminology going forward as well, because you're absolutely right. I see the importance of saying that, and I think you said the most critical part that I normally don't hear when people say enslaved versus slavery is holding the individuals who did the enslaving accountable. So I think that's a very important distinction. So thank you for bringing that clarification to the table, because now I can add it, that I'm work to add it to when I talk about slavery, utilizing the enslaved context of that.
Yeah, so if I could, I'd like to jump in and beginning, King, with what you said about the experience of having been, being the descendants of people who have been enslaved, and the strength that comes from that you spoke to, and that's one of the things that I address in the book. I don't speak to it the way you just did, and I really appreciate that. But I still remain amazed. Less so that some of the freed slaves fought in the Civil War itself, but more so that even during the Jim Crow era and the periods of lynching, they volunteered. The freed African Americans volunteered to fight in World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, participate to fight for the freedom of other people in Europe or Asia or wherever, before they really fully were the recipients of their constitutional rights and freedoms in the country that they were fighting for. So for me, that's an incredible example of strength and bravery and courage, and a bigger picture perspective. In other words, okay, this is our country, and we're willing to fight for it despite what has been done to our ancestors and what continues to be done to us. So that's the first point. I just think that's a real big deal, because I speak about the civil rights era and the periods of enslavement in the book, mainly to set context for what we're experiencing now. When I write about the book, so it's a past informed look at the present. And Ava, I just love that you and somebody gave me that language flip a few years ago about, rather than saying, just using the word slaves and slavery, but speaking about being either an enslaved person or an enslaver. And it makes, a big difference. Because in this country, we know of Native peoples as, there are over 500, Native American nations. But, we know the Iroquois or the Crow or the Apache or the Comanche or the Lakota. But we don't hear as much, unless we happen to be Cuban or Puerto Rican or Dominican, about the Taino, or further south into South America about the, in history we did learn about the Aztecs and them. But so the truth of the history and what was done by people who began, I don't want to say innocently, but I'll say who began as explorers, and who perpetrated what I basically claim was an unhealthy sense of being woke, or more woke, before this language was used, and a perpetration of literal cancellations of cultures back 400, 300, 200 years ago. So I'll just stay with the British for now, since we're in the United States, and the Spanish colonized, parts of the Caribbean, central, what we now call Central and South America. The Portuguese and the French did to a smaller degree. But my experience of what happened with the early British slave trade is that the British people, as the Greeks had done before them, centuries before, felt they were a superior culture. And when they came upon the Africans, who spoke different languages, who looked different, who had different rituals, the British felt, rather than just being different from, they felt superior to. And another way to say it is they felt more woke. That the Africans that they met didn't have Christ yet. They weren't Christians, so that means they were a notch below. And de facto, whether they consciously intended to do this in their attempts to convert people to Christianity, was they effectively, as you said, Ava, they effectively canceled the roles that these enslaved peoples played before they were kidnapped. It was a cancellation of individual human lives and a cancellation of the roles these people played in their cultures of origin. So, I say it that way because I want to point to that this whole idea of being woke and canceling in our current culture is not new. It's just the language of it is new. So I just want, so I really appreciate what each of you has said, and I'm just trying to tie that into how I wrote about it in this particular chapter, because in the absence of these histories, of the strength that, that came from being enslaved, and again, I'll state the obvious, no one here is saying that being enslaved is a good idea. And the language move from speaking about slavery versus being enslaved or being an enslaver, in the absence of a knowledge of those things, seeing, and I'll just use one horrible example, but seeing Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes or whatever, 2 years ago, happened in a larger context. It would have been horrible if there had not been the history that there is, but it's even more frightening because of the history, and we can see how it can still happen because of the history. So that's the connection that I like to make. It's really hard to speak about the present, and this is James Baldwin's great quote, and I can't quote it, but I'll paraphrase it, that history is not something about the past. History is what we carry in our bodies. And it's really hard to understand our present situation in the United States in an ignorance of a true and accurate iteration of the historical events that began with the founding, well, actually preceded the founding of this country, but have followed, the country's growth for, we just turned to 246 years old this past July 4th. So anyway, I'm going to put a pause button there because I could also, as you said, Ava, earlier, I don't want to steal the conversation here.
Please do. I like what you're saying. It's interesting to hear various perspectives on it. I think making the connections between then and now is very important because everyone has heard of the saying that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And this time, I think there are more people who are going to repeat the history of previously oppressed cultures. And we can see that through even bodily autonomy. We can see that through media literacy or media illiteracy. We are seeing things that may have been relegated to Black and brown folks at one point, now happening to everyone. And if people don't understand why it was important for it to not occur to anyone, they're not going to see when it happens to themselves. They've kind of detached themselves from that. So I think that it's really important to have these conversations so that people can recognize if they didn't know before, they can know now. And then they are less likely to be able to say, well, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I wasn't there. But if you're complicit when you have somebody who was pressing his knee against somebody's neck and don't understand the context of how and why that can happen, then you're going to miss other things that may happen to you because you're not aware enough. to understand the trajectory of history without an intervention.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree wholeheartedly.
And I think that brings to a even broader discussion around, and I think that's one of the things we don't do enough, is discuss the difference between accountability and responsibility. Like most people defend being responsible. Like I wasn't responsible for what my ancestors did, right? And that's their defense. And folks get caught up trying to defend that or argue that point. And I think it's not so much about being responsible, but being accountable. And I use an analogy of where I live in my community to make this point. Like I live in the inner city of Baltimore City. And as a result of living in the inner city, all things come along with that is we have pretty much trash cans lined up all along my block. And I live on a very busy block where it's bus stops and there's store up the street. So folks go to that store, they get off that bus, and they just throw trash on the street. So every day I have to go out there and clean up trash in front of my house. And even my neighbor's house, because if I don't, it's going to blow up in front of my house anyway. And so my point is, I'm not responsible for that trash. But because I'm an active participant in my community, I'm accountable for that trash. And I understand that accountability requires me to go beyond what's my comfort level and take accountability for making sure my community thrives. And I say the same thing when it comes to that part of our history, that as we talk about becoming fully human and beginning to connect with that fully human, what that really means is becoming accountable to how the history that our ancestors have contributed among people, how we're accountable to that. And that's where I think that if folks begin to really see that, we can really begin to have those real conversations. Like for you to write the book, Reggie, I think that you are taking on, you can correct me if I'm wrong for saying this, but my assumption is you're taking on a certain amount of accountability and how you bring this lens to that. Talk about the things, again, from what you've written in your book, as we talk about the woke and council culture. Another chapter is dealing with, you talk about the masculine and the feminine. And so now from all intents and purposes, from just the physical perspective, we'll say, well, you're a white man. So you've been the one that's been privileged by all of this. Who are you to write this kind of book? But I see that as a form of you taking accountability to say, I understand this. And yes, we've talked about before, your Italian culture and kind of some of the racism and subjugation, your culture, your people have gone through this country as well. But in just the white man perspective of it, I applaud you for taking that accountability, because had you not wrote that book and begin to bring those historical perspectives together, then we wouldn't be having this discussion about the narratives. And I think that's really at the crux of what it really is. It's the narratives that really paint people's perspective on things and how they see history. Just real quick, I want to make this point, because I love watching YouTube more than anything else right now, because not only is it video on demand, but I look for the comments in the section of the video. Mm-hmm. So I'm not talking about just watching YouTube music videos. I'm talking about watching historical documentaries or podcasts or discussions like that. And what was interesting was there was a discussion that was talking about the impact of racism and white supremacy that's really coming out right now. White nationalism is the term they utilize. And it was the gentleman that was being interviewed talking about what the Jews are really going through right now as a result of that. And so in the comments, of course, the comment got to Israel and Zionism and what Israel is doing in Palestine and to Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But what was really interesting is how the comment shifted from folks trying to understand the difference between Zionism and Judaism. Because people who are Zionists try to make it all as one. But when you really look at it, it's really, Zionism is really like the far right of Judaism, as far as to use an analogy. It's that kind of, we're in control, we have the rights, we demand to have this ability, we're the chosen people type of mentality, and that's not all Jews feel that way, that they have that kind of mentality. So I just want to kind of just throw that in around the false narratives again, just kind of get your all's thoughts about bringing it back to that discussion.
Yeah, I just believe, I mean, this is kind of a superficial content, but it doesn't directly address the Zionist, you know, Judeo difference. But I've found that looking at the comments on any YouTube post, the comments tend to tell me a lot more about the commenter than about the original video, whatever it
Right.
was. Because rarely is there a coherent thread, and that's the downside of I think all social media, because people just see something, they kind of get a sense of what it might be, and they give their opinions about how they see the world or whatever. And so I bow to you, King, for staying with that, because it's immensely frustrating. We learn a lot more about the specific commenters, but I think that's true in the conversations, except for in our conversations because we're special together. But that's a joke for anybody that's here for the first time. But I think it's really true for a lot of conversations around race. And even, I mean, because Kendi made this really clear, and he said it both in, I think it's primarily in Stamped from the beginning, where he said he witnessed a dual, DUAL, and dueling, DUELING, progression of racial progress and racist ideas. So for every time there was progress, and this is, he's speaking about his body of research in writing that book, which is extensive. He said both of those things would happen, and typically more racism would appear in response to, or as a backlash to, some kind of racial progress. It happened at the end of the Civil War. We had Jim Crow and 50 years of lynching, through 1950, give or take, with the lynching. After the Civil Rights Act, we had a real deep pushback from some of the federal government, both against hippies and the Black communities. I mean, there's a whole riff I won't get into there. And then after Obama got elected. So there's always been this pushback against racial progress. And Kendi's capturing of that, in my reading of it, I mean, the language is so beautifully precise. A dual and dueling progression of racial progress and racist ideas. So I think, King, what you're saying about the YouTube thread, it just makes perfect sense, because there are people who really do want the world to be the way it used to be, or, make America great again. And there are those who are intuitive and insightful enough to say, well, okay, pick a year. When was it so great, and for whom was it great? And then that, Make America Great Again falls apart, because it was never great for everybody. So anyway, I'm going off on a kind of a little bit of a tangent there, but
well, I think, if I may, you raise a good point when it comes to Make America Great Again. A lot of people, and even before Make America Great Again, people would talk nostalgically about the good old days.
Yeah.
And I think that also is part of a failure of the education system, or honesty within all communities, to say, even for white people, things were not always great. If they were uneducated or economically disadvantaged, they may have had whiteness as an advantage, but that was not very much when you're sharecropping, or you're not able to afford food for your table, or you're standing in the food lines during oppression during Depression era. Mm-hmm. So that sense of making America great again, or the good old days, I think comes from this fantasy that a lot of people have, that because they were white, they were all plantation owners, they were all enslavers, they were all being served, they all had great jobs working with these big corporations, they were all CEOs, which simply just isn't the case. There were poor people, there were uneducated people, there were people who were unhealthy as well. And so the good old days were not always great. And for those who want to go back to it, they might want to explore really where their family was in the system at the time to see if they really would want to go back to those good old days. So I think that is definitely a false narrative that needs to be addressed over and over and over again. But I also, if you don't mind, just a few more seconds, wanted to go back to, okay, thank you. Go back to what King was saying about his appreciation for you writing your book. Because I think that, this is just my opinion, but I think that people hear things differently or hear things at all from people, from certain people. So what King and I may say may go unheard, but what you may say to somebody who is not of color, white, not of color, may go over very well. And so you have people like Peggy McIntosh or Robin DeAngelis and Tim Weiss who have an audience because he can speak to them, that he's considered one of them. And that is a privilege to be able to reach the masses that I think a lot of white people do not take. And we need more people to take that privilege of being able to talk person to person with somebody who sees themselves in you or the examples that I've given, because that's how things will change. Black people, people of color, have been saying this message for the last 100 of years, and we've certainly made progress. But if we were to have everyone on board with this message, we would reach a lot more people. So I also appreciate you taking on a very complicated, controversial subject as someone who may not have experienced or have an ancestry that experienced it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ava. I appreciate your saying it. And King actually, I think it was in our second conversation, I forget, but King actually you asked me that question, King. You said, don't take it personally, I think you said, but, why is it, or how do you think you're qualified to write this book as a white guy, effectively? You asked it much more skillfully than I just said it, but that was the question. And the joke was, Phil, I've been writing the book for 3 years. I mean, the book is written now; it's in production and being proofed and everything else. But I've been reading about what would become the book for the last 6 years or so. So it's been an investment of time, and I've been thinking about the answer to that question before anybody asked it, because I tend to be, obsessive compulsive. Not really, but I tend to have a self-preservation streak, and I like to be prepared. As a classroom teacher, I was prepared. As a basketball coach, I was prepared. So I like to be ready. And my best answer to it is, first, I think because of what I've studied and tried to do with my life over the last, 48 years or so, in terms of the work world, as a Catholic school teacher, a New York basketball coach, a teaching poet, an integral coach, where I've really committed to wanting to see extraordinarily wider, deeper views. That, for whatever reason, I can't take credit for that, but I've always been interested in that. And I think I was able to write this book, which probably beginning about 2 years ago, the book began to write me, because some of the connections I began to see, I feel like anybody who writes or paints or creates anything knows what this means. Like, certain things were coming to me that I had no business seeing. So I was working hard, but the muse was working hard too. But I think it was, in fact, I like to say my Italian American, because I'm second generation. So my people have been in this country for a very short time, compared to descendants of slaves or the people that came over on the Mayflower. But because I'm a cisgendered, heterosexual, white guy, and because I'm trying to take this bigger picture, I didn't just look at race, or I didn't just look at gender, or just look at violence, which includes all of us, or just look at sexual identity, or just look at whatever, pick one. And as somebody who, because of my appearance and my background, it's a minority, but there are still some people who see me and basically say, well, you're an old white guy, shut up. Which I'm not the best person to say that to, because I can respond, articulately. But I think that was the advantage I did have, that I wanted to see this bigger picture, if I were African American, I think I probably would have focused more on race. If I were gay, I think I probably would have focused more on sexual orientation. If I were trans or bi, I think I might have focused more on sexual identity. I mean, I don't know that. If I were a woman, my take would be different. So I think, being at the intersection of what I'm at the intersection of, again, white, cisgendered, heterosexual male, it allowed me or invited me to look at this broader perspective, recognizing my good fortune. Again, my family of origin was one that you referred to, Ava, because my grandparents came here with nothing, and my parents got a little more, and because of the choices I made, like I got even less than my parents did because I wanted to teach in a Catholic school and be a poet, which, not the move you want to make if you want to have a really nice retirement account. But I'm making up for that in some ways now. But I'll work till I take my last breath. But I appreciate that because it's a legitimate question, and I think my response. Well, I know that my response is authentic coming from me. How anybody else might hear it, I have no control over that, and that's fine. But I appreciate your pointing to that, and I think because I was able to, is why I wrote this book, the way I wrote it. So.
And I think, if I may, people also, I certainly understand the argument that if it's never happened to you, how can you talk about it? But the other side of that argument is, does something always have to happen to somebody before they can be empathetic and sympathetic to it happening to somebody else?
Yeah.
And that's a quandary argument that we can have, and it's reasonable to have. I've had it myself, but in some instances, we have to look at intention and intent for the book. You're not trying to say this happened to me, and so this is what it's like. You're telling a story of what's happened to people, which takes a different perspective than someone who's saying, look, what this happened to me. There's a lot of people who are using false histories to write books of something that they know nothing about, but they have read other people's stories, and they think they can adopt those stories and then be able to teach other people, which is insincere, not at all conscious, and it doesn't hold up in the light. So I think the perspective from which someone who has not encountered some of the issues that we are talking about takes is so important to how the message will be received.
Yeah. So I just want to jump in really quickly, King, on that. And Eva, thank you for that, because the first chapter of the book is entitled Cultural Givens and the View from Here. And here means behind my eyes, behind the author's eyes. So I actually addressed that very issue in chapter 1. And I talk about what I was given as a child, genetically, geographically, chronologically, ethnically, blah, 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 all of those things, my earliest experiences and the worldview that I was given. And I, for 2 or 3 pages, I get really specific about what I was given and how I view the world now. And most of my cultural givens, America is the greatest country in the world, Catholic Church is the one true church, blah, 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 all these different things I was given as a child in the 1950s and 60s, many of them, the vast majority of them, haven't held up. I joke that the only one that holds up is, the Yankees still are the winningest team ever in baseball, because they, and now they actually are too, so, which is kind of cool, but that's an aside. But then I make it really clear that to anyone who might ever pick up the book and read it, that every human being has his or her or their own set of cultural givens. And it's up to each of us to get really clear on what we were given at birth and through our formative years, and even through adolescence as well to a certain extent, and then begin to unpack that and see how it holds up against our direct experience of living a human life. And that theme carries throughout the book, on chapters on women, on African Americans, on Native Americans, on Vietnam, on post 9/11, because it's never irrelevant to anyone, because we're all given that. And I share mine in the book because those are mine, and that's the lens through which I'm writing. So I'm not saying this is this is the right view. I'm saying this is the view that's given you this book. Do with it what you will. But before you do with it what you will, get clear on your own view. How do you see? Because you're interpreting the world through your own lenses. And that's a really important piece that transcends everything and applies to every human being, I believe. I mean, somebody prove me wrong, I'll be happy to listen to them, but I don't think that piece can be really pushed back against too much. So thank you for pointing to what you just pointed to, Ava. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of
And I
course.
know I kind of cut you off, Ken. So sorry.
No, that's okay. What I wanted to really kind of make sure we emphasize on the show is that as we talk about this topic of slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights, and that's been talked about a lot, obviously on different podcasts and different documentaries and different books. But we're exploring it from a context of how to be fully human and talk about it, right? Not just talking about it from, I'm a Black man and I'm going to share my pain and trauma experience with it, but how do I take that information and become more human as I begin to live my life? That's where the perspective I'm coming from with it. That's really what the show is about. And within that context, I'm always looking at how can I take history, read about it, and then begin to apply it in my life now on this journey, right? And it's never in the context of getting information to hate. Because to me, hate is not becoming fully human. It's staying within a particular tribe, saying, okay, I'm going to double down on being a Black man. So yeah, I can take this information in history, and here's my reason to not like individuals because of that and what's happened to Black men, or actually what's happened to Black men now. I still think that navigating life as a Black man in the world, if you get from the time you wake up to the time you come back home and get in bed, it's literally like playing Russian roulette every single day, because you not only have to deal with the fact, especially not going to speak about it in America, but I can walk out my door and the chances of likelihood of me being killed because of someone who looks just like me is high. Then if I get past that danger, I got the danger of the police that might kill me. You know what I'm saying? So then if I get past that danger, then I have the danger of the diet in my community, the grocery stores, so I could die from health issues. Then if I get through all those dangers, then if I have a woman in my life in which she's going through her life, the trauma and the experiences, she might have issues with me. So to be able to get at bed at the end of the night navigating through all those dangers, to me is something that I have to look at how I can be fully human in order to stay even sane with that. Because I see how other people are dealing with it, particularly guys I grew up with, and they turn to things such as drugs, they turn to things such as gambling or whatever it is to take their mind away from it, to numb that pain that they're dealing with that's attached to it, right? And so that's why I think it's really important, as we talked about before, understanding history. But understand, like I said, but now it becomes, why are you reading history, right? That's where I'm going with this whole conversation I'm leading with. Or are you reading history to learn how to become a better human, to become more informed, or to double down on your perspective and what you believe to be your particular agenda, or defend your particular position? And again, if that's the reason, then you're going to get a totally different perspective on history, right? Mm. And that's what I'm saying nowadays as we look at politics, and we utilizing politics to continue to further divide people in this country even more. Because now, it used to be you can be a Republican and you can be a Democrat, and at the end of the day, once one won or lost, you just go ahead and say, okay, well, this is the president, and we have to roll with it. I mean, I like this president, but it wasn't a hatred, a vitriol, and now it is. It's like, and not only that, it's for the candidates themselves. I mean, people like, for example, Republicans can't stand AOC at all. I mean, like life threats, Nancy Pelosi, life threats. And then you look at the other extreme of that, and you got folks who can't stand Donald Trump and want life threats against Donald Trump. And it's like, how are we slipping into that particular perspective? And that's where I think each person has to begin to say, I have to stop and ask myself, what can I do to become more fully human with this information that I'm receiving from whether it's CNN, Fox, MSNBC, or wherever you gather the information? What is it causing me to think? What is it causing me? And what actions do they want me to do as a result of the information they're giving? So that's kind of the context I want people to think about, even as we talk about slavery, Jim Crow, the civil rights, even within that context. Once I consume this information, why am I doing it? And then what are the behaviors that's going to come from me as a result of this information I receive? I know I just said a lot there, but I just wanted to really throw it out there because this is what I'm really seeing in the world now from the news media that I do watch, some of the news. It gets to the point where I actually can't watch much news because it's not really news, it's just slanted perspective. Here's what I want you to think on this particular topic, right? And I want you to believe in this and act according to this way, as opposed to just getting information that's supposed to be, here's information, you decide to do with it what you want. So I just wanted to see what you all's thoughts were on how you all see, as you be talking this conversation, what are you doing to help keep yourself fully human as you go forth in your life with all the energy that's out in the world that's being put out in the world
right now? But that's, I mean, it's a big, important question. I wish I had the answer that would resolve that for everybody. I don't have that answer, that's for sure. But I do have. I mean, how I try to embody that is, in terms of history. When I read history, when I read current events, which are effectively their history, because I'm reading about them, they happened in the past, even if it was, yesterday. What really helps me is trying to remember, and I do a pretty good job with this now. I'm approaching 70, so I should not much time left. Hurry up. But to remember that whether it's AOC or Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell or George Washington or James Baldwin or people in the past, people in the present, and we're only talking about the famous people that we know of. Every human being who's ever been born and who has ever died and who's living now and who will die is just that, a human being, and was an infant at some point and grew up as a young child and gradually began to have some kind of aspiration or sense of the world. And it grew up through a sense of innocence early on. Some didn't because of the situation they were born into. But I try to just remember that, especially with people with whom I vehemently disagree. And remembering that humanity, that common humanity in moments of tension or disagreement. Pick a war, the number of people who died in a given war, civilians and combatants. I mean, think of those lives and think of the survivors. So I just try to remember that every one of us has this little blip in terms of the age of the universe. If we're lucky, we get into our 80s, 90s, or maybe we break 100. If we're less fortunate, maybe we die earlier. And we have this short, as far as I know, this short time to walk the earth, as does everyone. And how can I best honor, especially because it's easy to honor people we like and get along with. That's, even though family can drive us crazy, but especially those we disagree with. And remember, this is another being just like me, different view, different values, different bank account, different car, all the superficial stuff, but it's another human being. And that helps me as I walk through my life. So anyway, period. I'll just end that there.
It's a tough question because when you say fully human, to me, emotions, the range of emotions, is a fully human aspect of humanity. So getting angry, wanting to escape, being kind, loving, all of those, jealous, all of those things have been human emotions since the beginning of time. Whatever, if you believe Christianity, the Bible is filled with stories of all of those emotions. And we see them every day in different people. So it's not that experiencing those emotions makes someone, as I'm thinking about this, in my opinion, not fully human, but the context in which they display them or act and behave according to that emotion can be inhuman. And that's what I think a fully human person is able to control. They're able to put the emotion in the right context so that they are not overblowing something or under considering something, which takes years of practice, which is why I advocate that emotional intelligence skills are taught in schools from a very young age, because it takes years and years of practice to have that consciousness, that awareness at the time and the moment of what is driving an emotion, to make sure that it is accurate and fitting for the occasion. And many times, as we see people being very eager, easily triggered, angry, road rage, things like that, the, the impulse control is not there, and they haven't learned to manage those emotions, to say, okay, I'm not going to pull out a weapon and point it at somebody because they didn't have their blinker on. It's just too far of a, too disproportionate to the situation. And so to me, I really appreciate and think people are fully, or are becoming fully human, because that too is a practice, just like consciousness. Becoming fully human is a practice. I don't think anyone is there yet. But to understand that more and start practicing that more, putting the context to the emotion and making sure it's appropriate for the situation and not unreasonable, I think is, to me, what I try to do to become fully human, and what I appreciate other people doing when I think about being self-actualized and fully human.
Yeah,
Period.
I love that you said practice too, because that's it. I mean, I believe that intentional practice is essential for the health of humans in the 21st century. If we and there's a lot to practice. So I'm 100% on board with emotional competence and emotional regulation. But practice is a big deal. So thank you for injecting that word into this conversation, Ava. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like learning. That's where. See, I'm in a quest, my own personal quest of self mastery, right? And I know I won't arrive there, but it's a journey. And on that journey, then I'm gonna discover, learn new things, incorporate new things, change things in my life. But it's keeping in mind that it is a journey, and that's a great way to really help folks understand why we're having these conversations. We like to say that we don't have the answers, but what we're committed to is the conversation. And through the conversation, we can learn, we can grow. So as we get ready to bring this conversation to a head, or bring the show to an end, I should say, one of the things we love to do is, it's not tradition, is to further expand this idea of building fully human connections by identifying someone, either past or present, who we believe exhibits these characteristics, these qualities, or has either lived or is living life as a fully human individual. So, Ava, with you being a guest to the show, who would you say
Okay.
comes to your mind?
Okay. Well, I'm going to preface this by saying there are so many people in history that it would be unfair to choose one. But I don't know that there are so many people currently, so it's easier to do so. So, to me, I would say that Ava DuVernay, I mentioned her before, to me is as close to fully realized that I have seen anyone yet, because of the way she tells stories, the honesty, the depth and the breadth. She's a mother. She achieved her success later in life, so she always was working towards something and didn't give up And I like that spirit of, stick to itness. And so to me, Ava embodies those characteristics. And she's somebody that people can know today. They don't, if I mention somebody in the past, they may not know, but I think a lot of people know who she is. So they can instantly understand who I'm talking about.
Reggie, you want to share yours?
Yeah, so because of current events, this figure is now a historical figure. But we lost Bill Russell this week, and when I was growing up, as a kid who liked basketball and was in New York, so Bill Russell, because he was with the Celtics, was the enemy as for a New York kid. But I was 12 or 13 when Muhammad Ali, was stripped of his title for, not agreeing to go to Vietnam, going into the army. And Bill Russell was one of the people who supported him publicly. And Russell transcended his gifts on the court, which were formidable, with his presence as a man, and specifically as an African-American man, a black man, in the 60s and actually beginning in the 50s, I guess, when I was really young, but into the 60s and through the 70s, throughout his whole life, as a real role model and a really clear-minded, articulate spokesperson for what I would just describe as sanity, in our country. So I just want to point to the late now Bill Russell for his presence on this planet for the years he was alive.
Rest in power.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely rest in power. And as you
and Nichelle Nichols.
Yes.
Sorry.
No. Absolutely.
I said and Nichelle Nichols, who was on Star Trek. You heard on Star Trek. She just passed away this week too.
Thank you both for saying those names, because you're absolutely right. They both were icons. They both did great things. They established presence. I mean, because of Nichelle Nichols, watching Star Trek was something that I saw myself now in space as a result of that. That's what she brought to that table. I would have to say mine would be Harriet Tubman. And I say Harriet Tubman because, to me, when you really study, when you hear the term hero and you say superhero, right? But when you really look at her life and you study what she was able to do despite what she went through, to think about the fact that she made over 385 trips back south and never was caught, never lost one enslaved person that she helped free. That's phenomenal. That's fathomable in this mind the days now. Folks wouldn't even walk to, I live in Baltimore, you wouldn't even walk down to Virginia. Yet still she was going deep into the South and was an elderly woman that had seizures. She had every reason to not do it. Like people would say, I can't walk, I have this, or I have this ailment, or whatever it may be. She walked and dealt with the uncertainty of death on a daily basis. And to think about having the faith to say, I'm going to run. I'm going to escape from being a slave. And now I got to trust along this journey, white people who I've only known to be evil to me. I had to believe now that just because they have a candle in their window, this person is a friendly person, right? Just even think about that as an idea is not even questionable in my mind. But when you finally do that, you get free and you escape. To hear the thought in your mind and you saying this is God telling you go back, right? And then you do it again to get your family, then go back and you do that to the point where that's how she gets past that. She she joins the Civil War. So and then fights as a spy and just in that space, that kind of person to me doesn't exist anymore. I don't see anyone who fits that model in today since her. So that's why I have to say, forever, Harriet Tubman to me deserves not only to be on the $20 bill, but every other lifted up as this truly superhero person because of that. She's my example of someone who's fully human. So I want to thank our listening audience for listening to today's show. I want to thank David Montgomery. Again, thank you for writing the book. And thank you all for your investment of time and energy And I hope, listening audience, you got some value from today's show as we continue to build this out, continue to have these discussions on how to become fully human and begin to make these fully human connections, not only with ourselves, but with others. So, thank you. Next Wednesday, everyone be blessed and have a productive week.
Thank you, King. Take care.
Thank you.